Now going to the next discussion, which will be a panel discussion, but hosted by our knowledge partner, Nicole Rocque, who is an innovation specialist from the Good Food Institute in India. She's leading a smart protein corridor initiative focused on building business and knowledge ties in protein innovation between markets like Sweden and India. Experience in as investment specialist with Invest India and advisor to life sciences groups, including pharmaceuticals and biotechnology business in India. She's worked across entry advisory and policy advisory and grievance redressal in multiple markets in North and South America. I call upon Nicole Rocque to take it ahead from here as a panel moderator and presenting more about the Good Food Institute and their work with smart proteins. Nicole.
Thanks so much, Rahul. I'm just going to share my screen. So, just give me a second. Okay, great. You have it up. Thanks so much. So very quickly, for those of you who are not yet familiar with our organization, Preetham, if we could move to the next slide, please. The Good Food Institute India is part of a network of global non-profit agencies. Put very simply, we work with scientists, with entrepreneurs, with investors, and other stakeholders who are diversifying the protein sources for a more sustainable, healthy, and just food system. If we can move to the next slide. Over the course of the next 10 minutes, I really just want to set context for the upcoming Innovative Foods panel that I'll be hosting and just share where India and where Sweden really fits into this global discussion. Moving very quickly to the challenge that we have ahead of us. In 2019 alone, around 2 billion people globally faced food insecurity. As global population increases, we're going to need food systems that supply at scale to address the expansion in demand due to upward social mobility, increased urbanization, changing demographics, etc. Preetham, next slide, please. So we're looking at roughly a 56% food production gap by 2050. This increase in demand will likely be met through an increase in production. The implications for these changing patterns of growth and demand, specifically for animal-sourced foods, will require structural changes to the global livestock sector. This means massive, rapid intensification that will likely cause a shift towards an industrialized model of animal production, optimized for cost and efficiency, and thus adding significant pressure on dwindling natural resources. Preetham, next slide, please. Next slide. So the key question that really drives our work at GFI is how are we going to feed 10 billion people by 2050 through systems that do not negatively impact climate, biodiversity, and scarce natural resources. Our current food systems creates a whole host of sustainability-related issues. For example, animal agriculture contributes more to climate change than emissions from the entire transportation sector combined. This system is also fundamentally inefficient. If we take the chicken as an example, it currently takes about 8 calories of food in the form of feed to get back 1 calorie in the form of meat. Apart from this, about half of the world's habitable land is already devoted to agriculture, a vast majority of which is currently used for livestock production. And finally, there are all sorts of public health issues that emerge from animal agriculture, including and most urgently antibiotic resistance due to the overuse of antibiotics within animal agriculture, both as a veterinary medicine, but particularly as growth promoters, which threatens our own ability to treat infectious and non-infectious diseases moving forward as antimicrobial drug resistance grows. Next slide. So in terms of how this where India really sits within this entire context of animal agriculture, contrary to popular misconceptions, 71% of Indians do attest to eating non-vegetarian. This is a category which includes meat, seafood, and eggs, with respondents citing income rather than religious strictures as the major impediment for not eating non-veg more frequently. Next slide, please. Although India's per capita meat consumption is among the lowest in the world, with increased demands and urbanization, meat consumption per capita is poised to grow. Much of the protein demand over the next decade and beyond is going to come from emerging markets like India and China. So by the time we get to 2050, we're looking at between a 50 to 70% increased demand in protein. Next slide. At GFI India, we think a major aspect of this solution is through the use of smart proteins. Next slide, please. We want to meet consumers' demand for the meat they love in a way that is both better for the world and better for business. Next slide. At GFI, we define smart protein as products which can reliably and predictably substitute animal-derived meat, eggs, and dairy because they perfectly replicate not just the sensory aspects, but the cultural aspects as well of eating this food for consumers. Next slide. Smart proteins fit into 3 categories from a production, cost, and infrastructure point of view. This can be created using plant proteins to specifically replicate their animal-based counterparts and also offers significant advantages in terms of reduced environmental pressures associated with those same animal products. Secondly, fermentation technology has emerged as an enabling technology for the alternative protein industry to create both ingredients as well as standalone products leveraging microorganisms such as filamentous fungi and bacteria. And finally, you have cultivated meat manufactured using animal cell culture techniques to create genuine animal meat or seafood products that is composed of the same cell types arranged in the same 3-dimensional structure as animal muscle tissue. I'm going to skip through a lot of the explanation for each of these individual categories just to save on time. So Preetham, if we could skip through to the next section of the presentation, please. Great. In India, we're seeing plant protein emerge as an emerging trend. If we can move to the next slide, yeah. So in consumer research studies that were conducted by GFI both in 2018 as well as in 2020, we've seen an increase in the positive disposition, not just in the awareness about what these products are, but also consumers more likely to try these products as well as purchase them if they do find that they taste as well as taste the same as well as provide the same nutritional benefits as conventional meat does. Next slide. The opportunity really is to service this sort of early adopter cohort that we've been able to identify, which currently looks very similar to the demand that you might see within New York or Sydney or Australia. What this cohort really looks like is young, upwardly mobile, internet-connected, in parts aspirational cohort that really does exist within the country. Apart from this as well, there's also an underlying culture of guilt associated with eating non-vegetarian food in India, with religion designating certain days of the week and times of the year as holy, where animal meat and eggs are unfit for consumption. So what we're seeing is that this creates a sort of underlying tension where many young people are eating meat outside of the home, but continuing to live and feel guilty about it. So it's important to note that this underlying need states, that there's drivers for sort of these meat replacement products exist, whether that's intrinsic to planetary health or extrinsic like religious or social pressures. So manufacturers of these plant-based foods are no longer just targeting the vegetarian or the vegan population. Instead, they're also looking at both omnivores and flexitarians as their consumer market, which of course is a much larger opportunity. Next slide. Next slide. So while plant-based options started off, with ingredients like soy and jackfruit, which really acted as a mimic of the texture of meat, what we're seeing right now, specifically over the last couple of months, we're seeing products getting launched. Next slide. Getting launched across different formats, from main meals to snacking items that really resonate with consumers. And the market for all of this is really just taking off after years of ecosystem building work and all the disruptions that were associated with the pandemic as well. This graphic provides a small sampling of these sort of next generation companies that we're calling plant-based meat or plant-based dairy or plant-based egg companies. And these companies are really innovating quite rapidly, and we're excited about the opportunity to drive broad consumer awareness in the mass market because of these products that are being developed. But it's important to remember that in India has a vast population, and the smart protein market in the country will continue to present open spaces for international businesses to see as viable opportunities. Moving beyond that early adopter cohort that I just mentioned of about 50 to 75 million people in the top cities, accessing a huge target of millions more means creating superior products that can scale, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Next slide, please. Next slide. The alternative protein industry is projected to take a significant chunk of the global total protein market, with estimates ranging from about 3% by 2025 to about 60% by 2040, depending on how you want to look at it. Next slide. But investments too have really skyrocketed. Last year, we saw venture capital as well as private equity investments reach $3.1 billion globally, which is double the amount of all the investments to date. Next slide. Plant-based investments tripled while fermentation investments doubled. Although cultivated meat saw the smallest absolute amount of investment, we did see the largest increase, growing 6 times from 2019 to 2020. Next slide. And APAC as well has seen significant amount of investments, 6.1 times what was seen from any previous year. Next slide. A lot of this growth that we're seeing in alternative protein consumption is really being driven by critical drivers of taste, price, and convenience. We've seen price reductions being announced globally by the likes of Omnivore and Impossible Foods. We've also seen significant distribution increases in both retail and food service, making these products more accessible. There's also been many exciting innovations on the taste front. Next slide. But there is a long way to go before we do reach price parity as well as global widespread distribution. And this is especially critical for India, as I was mentioning earlier. The true opportunity is not just that early adopter market in the urban mega cities, but the hundreds of millions more in the true mass market. Getting these will require improvements in taste profiles, in prices, in ingenuity, in bringing products in different formats that will really allow scale across the length and the breadth of this country. This is where technologies and businesses from advanced market can help excel and help us open up the Indian market in a further win-win. India offers very specific opportunities to the international alternative protein market. Like the previous speaker, Dr. Babita had also mentioned, India's agricultural biodiversity presents an opportunity for plant-based protein companies worldwide to leverage some of these underexploited, diversified high-protein crop varieties that could really lend themselves to, superior functionalities and inherent nutritional completeness, as well as cleaner label products. Apart from that, we also have a robust workforce and a globally renowned biomanufacturing and pharmaceutical manufacturing industry that can do a great deal to really drive down the cost of alternative protein products globally. At Good Food Institute India, as Rahul had mentioned, we're working on what we're calling smart protein corridors. At the stage of where the Indian ecosystem currently is, we believe that there are advantages that we can derive by developing and leveraging cross-country relationships with more mature ecosystems to accelerate the rate of not just technology, but knowledge transfer into the Indian ecosystem as well. Maria and Cecilia had both sort of highlighted the advantages of the Swedish ecosystem. And we do see merit in sort of advancing the India-Sweden smart protein corridor, specifically across these 3 buckets of engagement. The first one being with knowledge institutes and universities. Cecilia mentioned, the forward-looking nature of some of these agricultural universities, and we're really looking to leverage that with our own universities in India, where we can leverage, joint collaborative research projects that can advance the sector globally, as well as with business and investors, and finally with governments and policymakers as well. With that, I'd like to pause, and I think it's a great time to sort of hear from our panelists. First, we have Daniel Ruben. He's currently the head of strategy and special projects at Stockeld Dreamery in Sweden. Daniel is a mentor for several food tech accelerators and an advisor to some of the leading ag tech and food tech startups in Europe, North America, and Africa. Prior to that, Daniel has also worked as an expert for the World Bank in Washington, D.C. On issues around technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. In his role as a consultant with the Rockefeller Foundation Food Initiative, supported the foundation's work to advance a more nourishing and sustainable food system. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Ramkumar Nair, who is the founder and CEO of Mycorena. Ram has over 8 years of research experience and 3 years building a biotech startup. Ram is specialized in handling multidisciplinary projects, focusing on resource utilization, and fungi biotechnology. Welcome, Ram.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Mark Kahn, managing partner and co-founder of Omnivore Venture Capital. Mark co-founded Omnivore in 2010 and is also the chairman of the Confederation of Indian Industries Task Force on Agri Startups and a member of the governing council of the Maharashtra State Innovation Society. Prior to this, Mark was the executive vice president at Godrej Agri-Work, one of India's foremost diversified agri-business companies. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
It's a pleasure being here.
And finally, we have Abhishek Sinha, founder and CEO of GoodDot. For Abhishek, it's really about the ethical benefits of plant-based lifestyle that are the major driving forces behind GoodDot's activities. With the focus on taste, price, and shelf life of its products, GoodDot has a unique and distinct approach to mainstream meat alternatives across the globe. Abhishek also has wide expertise in strategic alignment, product development, process engineering, and the regulatory landscape. Thank you for joining us, Abhishek.
Thanks, Nicole. Lovely to be here.
With that, I think we should just get started. So I'm just going to go around the room and ask each of you a question about what you do in the context of the market that you currently operate in. We'll start with you, Daniel. You've worn many hats across the alternative protein landscape. Would you give us an overview of what the ecosystem currently looks like in Sweden and the various areas of work that you have undertaken?
Sure, and you gave such a nice presentation to me earlier, so I don't think I need to really go in deep into what I've done. But obviously, I'm advising some startups in the food tech and ag tech space in Europe, Africa, and North America, mentoring at some accelerators, supporting some VCs as a venture partner. I run a food tech newsletter called Food Tech Weekly and a podcast called The Appetizer. So, and my daytime job is I'm working for Stockeld Dreamery, developing plant-based cheese. So lots of work, but let's delve into the ecosystem, which is really exciting. I think the Swedish entrepreneurial ecosystem for tech and innovation and startups in general is very strong. We have really good policy and regulatory. There are several world-class VCs here. There's some very strong educational institutions. For example, we have the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, which is ranked number 3 in the world after Wageningen in the Netherlands and UC Davis in California. Tech infrastructure is good. The labor force is skilled. There's risk tolerance. We have really curious consumers willing to try out new and crazy stuff. There's this strong push in society for more sustainability and nutrition. Greta Thunberg is from here. There's some really good accelerators, including in Norskian, focusing on impact. They're opening their second space now in Kigali, Rwanda. And there are some very successful startups that are inspiring other entrepreneurs to start out. I mean, you all heard of Truecaller and Spotify and Minecraft, just to mention a few. And in the food tech space, I'm sure you've heard of Oatly, the plant-based dairy company, and they IPO'd over $10 billion earlier this year. And I think this strong entrepreneurial ecosystem rubs off on food tech as well. A lot of entrepreneurs that made exits in tech are now starting food tech companies or investing in them. And this has helped make Sweden one of, I think, the leading food tech innovation hubs in Europe. Last year, European food tech startups raised 2.7 billion euros, according to Digital Food Lab, and Sweden was about 10% of that, so 260 million euros. And that made Sweden the number 4 destination in Europe for investments in food tech after the UK, France, and Germany. And there's everything from ag tech companies like Volta Green Tech, they're growing seaweed to block methane emissions from cows or livestock. Eriot doing wireless control of irrigation, Ecobot farm robots. There's surplus and waste management companies like the Karma food rescue app. There's urban farming, vertical farming startups. There's a lot of going on in smart packaging, sustainable packaging. Innocentia is one example with a team in India. There are e-grocers, last mile delivery companies popping up left and right. There's a lot happening in retail tech and marketplaces. TrustTrace is an example there, I think, of traceability. There's tons of consumer apps. And there's a lot of next-gen food companies. Stockeld Dreamery is trying to become the category leader in plant-based cheese. There's Hooked Foods for plant-based fish. There's Sprout for pea-based milk. Nix for sugar-free ice cream and candy. They're expanding a lot in the US. Expect to hear exciting news about them soon. So all in all, I think the ecosystem and the food tech ecosystem is very healthy and vibrant and well-funded and really hungry to advance a better food system. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for laying that out and for really giving us an overview of what the ecosystem looks like now. I think it's a good time to move to Mark. Mark, at Mycorena, you are creating plant-based meat products from fungi by leveraging fermentation technology. Would you tell us a bit about the genesis of Mycorena, as well as where you fit into the current food tech landscape that Daniel so clearly laid out for us?
Yeah, sure. I guess you pronounced Mark, but my name is Ram.
I'm so sorry.
No worries. No worries. I mean, you already gave a good introduction, as Daniel was telling. I mean, I am originally from India, so I have my roots back in South India. I came to Sweden in 2013 for my PhD studies. So by profession, I'm a fermentation engineer, and I have my PhD and postdoc in the same area that we are working. What we are basically doing is creating mycoprotein. I mean, if I go back to your presentation, one of the key point in the whole plant-based segment is fermentation itself. And we have mycoprotein as one of the main upcoming ingredient in one sense. And that's again our approach to work with all plant-based companies, more like a B2B approach where we can enable all these new generation food companies to create more sustainable products. I mean, in that context, we have discussed with GoodDot, and also like we have had discussion with Stockeld, and I personally know Daniel as well. So there's a lot of collaborations that we see already happening in the space, and that is what we are also leveraging on to create more sustainable alternative for peas and soy. So there is another category coming up, so people can really try new things, not just go by already existing ingredients. And speaking about Mycorena, we are currently one of the leading company in the space in Europe, and we are the only ones in Scandinavia doing mycoprotein. And we are growing quite big in terms of like the scale, which is a critical part in any ingredient businesses, as you already know. So we are building our first production scale capacity, which could cater pretty much the Scandinavian market in 1 year time. So that's what we are planning now. It's a $40 million investment that we are making in Sweden. And we are 25 people now in the company. So we are growing quite big in the last 3 years. There's a lot of growth that happens, both in terms of technology development and also in terms of the market development that we see. A lot of even large, big companies are interested in getting into the space. I mean, if I speak in the Swedish context, there is, pretty much industry leading companies that are now venturing into like plant-based segments, and they are looking for new generation alternatives because they already see that the market trend is clear with the plant-based growing up, and then peas and soy already taking a big part of the pie. And then they are now looking into like, what is next? What is the new generation ingredients that they could make? And in that context, we and Mycorena and the protein Fromic, it's kind of already positioned in a very strong segment, I would say. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ram. And I want to hold on to that point that you mentioned about, conversations that you've already started having with Abhishek. I'd like to hold on to that and maybe bring that up later in the conversation. Quickly switching to the Indian ecosystem, Mark, agricultural technology in India has matured quite significantly over the last decade, specifically since Omnivore Ventures first entered the game. Could you take us through what the ecosystem looked like when you first started and where we are now? Mark, you're on mute.
Sorry, it kept auto-muting me for some reason. So yeah, I mean, it's been a slightly crazy and a very long journey. When we started all of this, the ecosystem didn't really exist. That was why we initially started Omnivore, was that we saw that innovative agriculture and food entrepreneurs weren't really being backed by generalist VCs. There was very little capital in the space, and the first 5 years were, I would say, a combination of lonely and brutal. And at the same time, what you have in India is a massive agricultural ecosystem of 130 million smallholder farmers, roughly 25% of GDP if you take all the agribusiness into account, and more or less half of the employment in the country. And so this was too critical a space for India's future to be ignored, and that's why we helped this get off the ground. Today, it's obviously very different. There's quite a bit of agri-tech investing activity, quite a bit of innovative food investing activity. It's certainly come a long way, but massive challenges remain in terms of trying to address the core issues with Indian ag, which we see as kind of 4 big challenges. One being the challenge of farmer profitability. Farmers in India simply don't make enough money to survive. Second being the challenge of farmer resilience. They essentially, even if they have a good year, the next year is terrible, right? There is simply too much stress. Any startup entrepreneur knows what the fear of everything falling apart is like. Well, that's the experience of 130 million farmers every year, and their families, right? So about 600 million people in total. And so farmer resilience is a huge issue. Agricultural sustainability is the third issue that our portfolio companies work on. How do we reduce the usage of natural resources in the system? How do we reduce the wastage and spoilage in the system? And finally, catalyzing climate action. India is on both sides of the climate issue. Agriculture accounts for 20% of India's emissions. So that's something that has to be dealt with. And India is also one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. So we're dealing with both the mitigation of greenhouse gases and resilience and adaptation for this agricultural system. So everything in our portfolio is generally hacking away at least one, if not multiple, parts of this problem. Alternative protein for us is a relatively new space. It's one that we've been active in intellectually. It's not one that we've invested in yet. We've collaborated quite a bit on thought leadership with GFI. We've done lots of workshops. We've judged lots of startups. We think we'll probably take a bet in the space in the next year. We're not a super consumer focused fund, so a lot of the bets in the space are really very consumer oriented. But we think the applicability and relevance in India for alternative protein is interesting, right? It's I don't think it is the slam dunk that everyone thinks it is. I have said this many times, right? In America, if you want vegetarian food, burgers, fake plant-based burgers that bleed are very appealing because you are historically from a non-vegetarian family, right? Your ancestors ate meat, your parents ate meat, you grew up eating meat. Maybe you're a flexitarian now, maybe you became a vegetarian or a vegan, but you have that taste. You would say the taste for blood. In India, if you want to eat vegetarian food, you eat vegetarian food. While 70% of India is non-veg, the way that I like to describe it is the default setting in the operating system that is Indian culture and society is set to vegetarian. You have to ask for meat in India. The default meal you are given is a vegetarian meal. The default restaurant is a vegetarian restaurant. You will see a red dot on every bit of packaged meat in this country, specifically to let people know, don't eat this, it has animal products in it that aren't dairy, to be clear. We think a little bit differently about dairy here. And so we think it's an interesting and to be clear, worthwhile problem to solve. We just think it is radically different from flexitarianism in the West. We think it is radically different from China moving away from, consuming every form of animal protein imaginable, right? This is a very different system of meat consumption, where even the people that eat meat eat it very rarely. It is flexitarian by default. Hindus, right, have seasons where they don't eat meat, things like Shravan. There are many people that don't eat meat on 2 or 3 days of the week. So in general, right, this is not a system where meat eating is ubiquitous. It is not a system where meat eating is by any stretch of the imagination close to the level seen in the West or in our neighbors to the East. It is a very different system. That is not to say that there's not opportunity. That's not to say that there isn't the chance to substitute, especially processed animal products, for plant-based substitutes and eventually fermented and cellular. It is just very, very different. And it worked in Silicon Valley, so it will work here approach, we think is absolutely foolhardy, because we think, practically speaking, the market that you're playing at here is not vegetarians, right? The 40% of the country that is vegetarian, they have a great solution for what they want to do in terms of remaining vegetarian, which is to say the default food. Right, and for the 60 to 70% that eats meat, that eats it not all the time, right? We think that segment is broken into 3 parts. A large part of that segment are among the poorest people in this country. The one thing to remember about vegetarianism in India: in the West, vegetarianism is left-wing. In India, vegetarianism is right-wing. In the West, vegetarianism is progressive. In India, vegetarianism is conservative. Vegetarianism in India is linked to income. It is linked to caste. The richest people in this country are vegetarians. So that's why a lot of people in the West, they're like, no, Indians are vegetarian. No. The Indian diaspora is vegetarian, because those are the people who could afford to leave. That's why your professors who are Indian were vegetarian. That's why your engineering co-workers and your doctors were vegetarian, because it is linked to income, because it is a proxy for caste. And so all of these things have to be understood when you're looking at the opportunity here. So the opportunity here then becomes, who are the people that are upper income that are also meat eaters? Because that's where you're going to build that's where you're going to start in any kind of product like this. You're not going to make a product for the bottom billion in this space, not yet, maybe in the future. So it's a unique ecosystem that has unique challenges. And dumping Silicon Valley nonsense here is not exactly going to work.
Thanks for that, Mark. And I think it's a good time to bring in Abhishek as well, because I think GoodDot was one of the first, I would say, smart protein companies in India, and they have a very unique approach to their product format, as well as their product offerings. So Abhishek, you began GoodDot about 5 years ago, where the ecosystem was even more immature than it is right now, and category awareness for these products was near zero. So really want to ask you about what your journey has been like and how you have seen this specific ecosystem grow over the last 5 years.
Is he still on? It seems he might have dropped out.
Oh, oops. We'll get back to Abhishek, I think, when he's back. But I think now could be a good time we can move into the focus of this session, really, which is building smart protein corridors, unlocking opportunities for technology transfer, licensing, business relationships, trade, government partnerships. And we think, which is a hugely important piece for the development of the Indian ecosystem, as well as a model for other developing countries as well. Daniel, we've regarded you as our sort of informal gatekeeper of the India-Scandinavia smart protein corridor. And we've highlighted across this session various strengths I think that Sweden and India each bring. What would you see as some of the foremost opportunities of collaboration across a Sweden-India smart protein corridor that you can pinpoint and that we can really get started and get moving on?
Wow, big question. Obviously, the two markets are incredibly different in terms of GDP and size and number of inhabitants and per capita income and so on. But I think those differences can be leveraged, for a good thing. For example, of course, if you're an innovative Swedish company, but maybe you need some R&D dry powder, you have some of the world-class, high-skilled people in India that you can leverage, and we've seen several companies do that in Sweden. Of course, vice versa, if there's an Indian company looking to break into Europe and they want to have forward-leaning consumers, curious consumers, they want to have a base, a foothold in the European market, Sweden is not a bad place to start. There are mission-aligned investors, mission-aligned people. I spoke with SenseGrass, for example. They're obviously not in the protein space specifically, but in the ag tech space, and they're interested in using Sweden as a bridgehead. So I think there are many opportunities for startups and companies to leverage each other's strengths in India and Sweden to sort of fast forward or pour some rocket fuel on your growth. I notice Abhishek is back, so I just want to make sure we have time for him.
Thanks. Hi, Abhishek.
I'm so sorry, actually, there was some network issue, power outages. Anyhow, please go ahead.
No, don't worry. So I think we ended at a very interesting point. Mark made a very interesting point as well about specific requirements of the Indian ecosystem. And I think GoodDot from the beginning has always sort of positioned itself on price accessibility and scalability. You also entered the market and the ecosystem when there was relatively no awareness about what these products are at all. So if you could just give us an understanding of what your journey has been like then, and what have you seen has happened over the past 5 years?
Sure, Nicole, thank you so much. So I see things very differently than what Mark perceives and what he sees. So our experience, our hypothesis is a bit different. So having looked at, it's right that 72% of Indians are meat eaters, and the other 28% are vegetarians. But even in your presentation, you found the biggest reason for people to eat less meat in India is because of the income. There is a challenge in the affordability of protein. Animal protein is seen as a premium product, even to many Indians. So thereby the price will be an important aspect. And definitely there are a lot of people who are willing to consume meat. Interestingly enough, through our distribution partner, which is in the tier 2, tier 3 cities, even towns and villages, we have seen a large-scale adoption and repeat purchase of plant-based meat products. So it's quite interesting. I think time will be giving the correct answer, but we do believe that there is a significant willingness of Indians to try out plant-based meat. They do have vegetarian values, and if it is they are provided a product which has no animal exploitation in it, but it tastes like meat, I think that opens up a very different opportunity in India. So that is where we are coming from, and we are quite excited as how things are growing. As I said, the customer stickability is quite high in the space in our own experience. So it's a challenge to make them try, but once they do try, they believe, and they come back for repeat purchases. So this is where we are coming from, and we're quite excited about the space. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I want to move back from the consumer side of things to the producer side of things. I think we mentioned, we believe as well that India has specific advantages, particularly with regard to its agri-biodiversity. And for that, Mark, I'd really want to come back to you. We're a country that produces some of these high protein substrates like millets and oilseeds, but we're really in need of technology interventions to create a sort of range of value added products that can also increase farmers' income. So what kind of intervention in fundamental technology and IP development do you think are required to get to a place where we can actually position India as a sort of smart protein ingredient supplier to the world?
Look, this goes to a very complicated issue. And that complicated issue is that in general, while India punches above its weight globally, well above its weight, with respect to digital technologies, hardware and software, in the life sciences space, India punches insanely below its weight, to a degree to which you would be shocked. The provocation that I oftentimes say, and everyone's probably heard this now many times if you listen to these seminars, is that there are more Indian passport holders doing cutting edge life sciences and synthetic biology work in the city of Boston than in the entirety of the subcontinent. It's a weird phenomenon of the startup ecosystem, of the talent ecosystem, that in life sciences to date, there is still very little entrepreneurship, and the best and the brightest, as they did in digital technologies a generation earlier, continue to migrate abroad. And so solving the challenges of innovation, and this is true in terms of synthetic biology for human health, it's true of synthetic biology for agriculture, it's true of innovations for innovative food. You still don't have deep pools of talent yet. I think there's some people that are trying to work on this space quite a bit. We are, for sure, GFI is, but the reality is there is a talent gap, there is a funding gap, there is an understanding gap, right? The average venture capitalist in India understands digital wonderfully. Life sciences is they've never done any deal flow. I can think of 3 VCs, maybe 4 in India, that have ever done a life sciences deal. Right? I can think of 50 VC funds in Boston that focus only on life sciences, right? So it's a very different system. A lot of the alt protein innovation that we see in India right now are essentially consumer plays, right? They're consumer plays that are doing formulation. Sometimes they're using imported, right, pea protein. It's deep innovation isn't yet happening. It's happening in pockets, right? And it's not to say India is bad at food processing. We have the CFTRI in Mysore. We have NCL in Pune. There's lots of people, but it's not that surplus of talent that you have in the digital and kind of startup space generally. And so this is a real problem that goes beyond alternative protein into this general area of life sciences and kind of, you know, innovation in chemical and biological kind of areas. So I think there is insanely high potential for India to eventually become the alternative protein ingredient supplier to the world, right? We're the largest producer of pulses in the world, largest producer of millets in the world, right? Farmers do not capture a lot of value for that. And so there is potential to build businesses where farmers capture value because you're doing, right, value-added processing and selling to the rest of the world. Early days, you have players like Proeon that are trying to do just that. There are a few other startups in that space, but it's still very, very nascent. And most of the startups that we see right now doing alternative protein in India are essentially consumer plays. But we're very bullish that there is going to be entrepreneurship in this space. But I think what is making it move a bit more slowly is this challenge around talent, facilities, right? That is true of the entire life sciences ecosystem.
With that, Daniel, if we could quickly go back to you and talk a bit about how the Swedish ecosystem can really come in here, how we can sort of leverage some of these collaborations to really move some of that forward, to move aspects of talent development forward, to move aspects of product development forward, bring in funding for activities like these.
I think the first step is just we need to collaborate more. We need more sort of exchange students going both ways. PhDs like Ram. We need 1,000 people like Ram. We need more. I think smarter government funding focused on particular pieces of the food system challenges that we need to solve and leverage each other's strengths. We need. I mean, there are gaps in for example, I mentioned that the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences is ranked number 3 in the world, and yet they spin out almost no startups. So there's this huge missed opportunity of turning that world-class leading research into actual startups that have, that's making true change on the ground, and that's a huge pain and a missed opportunity. So I just, everywhere I turn, I feel this sense of urgency to solve the challenges we're facing. There's a lot of smart people out there. We need to connect them, and we need to step it up, because it's so urgent what we need to do in terms of environmental challenges, nutrition challenges, animal welfare challenges, and so on. And so every time I meet policymakers and people not currently involved in food tech, I'm telling them you need to do food tech, and we need to have more international collaboration to solve these challenges, because it's not enough for Sweden with 0.1% of the world population to solve our challenges if we don't help the rest of the world to solve their challenges, and vice versa. So I could go on for a very long time, Nicole.
Thanks for that. And with that, I think this would be a great time to bring you back in, Ram. Mycorena's ProMyc mycoprotein has really important implications, both in terms of efficiency and sustainability, and could really potentially translate into nutritional and price advantages for low resource developing country environments like India. So if we could go back and sort of ask you about what kinds of international collaborations you've already cemented, as well as how you would look to leverage this kind of cross-country collaboration as well.
Absolutely. I mean, from my perspective, I have seen both sides. I have been growing up in India, doing my early studies there, and now I'm doing company in Sweden. So I can see it from both angles. And going back to what Mark and Daniel said, there is a huge leverage that we can take out of the competence of both the countries, like Sweden being very high cutting edge technology development. But at the same time, as Daniel already mentioned, it's a very small population here. So scalability is a big challenge when it comes to finding resources and stuff like that. Whereas if we go back to the Indian perspective, that scalability might be much easier in that sense, because there is already resource there in terms of the supply chain, larger population. So we could leverage that too in a very smart way, and also it goes back the other way around as well. So from what we see is okay, now we are doing things in Sweden, we are scaling up, building our first factory. But even I tell my investors, this is probably not the only factory that Mycorena will have. Perhaps we will go and scale in India or in China. So in that perspective, there is a large, approach that we can make out. But the main underlying principle is one single company cannot do this, or if they are doing it, it takes a lot of time. I mean, I have even tried it in the beginning, to find places in India where we can scale. And I, being an Indian myself, I find it super difficult to land on a right partnership. So then it comes to the fact that there should be a system that is supporting companies to go there, to build that corridor, or to build that kind of collaboration approach, enabling companies that they can help out when we are already there. For example, if Mycorena is going there, we need a system to back us up. And that's already happening in other industries very much. If you take Volvo, Scania, Ericsson, they all have development centers in India, big, huge centers, even 10 times bigger than what they have in Sweden. But that is initiated and it's kind of coordinated in a very structured, harmonic way. There is a long-standing relationship between, the governments, for example. There's a long-standing relationship between the Sweden Business Council and stuff like that. But that's all in that tech space. And now it's time for us to bring it to the next segment, whereas Mark was mentioning, India has everything that is needed to support that growth. And that's what we are looking for, or that's what we should initiate. And GFI could be a great partner to build that corridor already and bring in more actors into the space. And companies we are on the other side. I mean, we don't see that, necessity until there is a system already in place. Otherwise, it will be difficult for one single company to go and build that relationship. It has to be in a structured, organizational, different actors playing in it. That's how we see it, actually.
Thanks for that. And I think we do believe that India offers supply chain advantages as well to the international alternative protein ecosystem, and can do a great deal to sort of drive accessibility and drive down costs of some of these products globally. And with that, Abhishek, if you could help us identify what some of these strengths are and opportunities are for collaboration of this kind to really expand the accessibility of these products globally.
So I think it's a two-way process, Nicole. First of all, of course, access to markets outside India. For example, Europe can be a very big market. Sweden can be a base for because there are a lot of innovative policies and progressive policies in Sweden. As Daniel was mentioning, a lot of startups and very friendly policies are there. So that could be a launch pad for European expansion for the Indian startups from here. And on the contrary, there's 1.4 billion population which is protein starved, and also looking for innovative technologies. There could be some interesting relationships wherein on the basis of trust, as market access can be provided to some of the startups which are having cutting edge technologies in Sweden to India. Because I think that can be a happy marriage. It all comes down to who are mediating it, who are the parties who are coming together, and how is the regulatory environment. Because even in India, I think a lot of things needs to be eased out and legal protection needs to be given to a lot of IPs to be for the company standards. But I do believe India very soon will be the most populous country in the world, and that too food is going to be both an opportunity as well as one of the significant challenges for India. As you mentioned, feeding 10 billion, that's a global population, but India in itself is a massive part of the 10 billion population. So it is a challenge, but it's a very, very big opportunity. People who are able to understand the market, have the good relationship and crack it will reap the most benefit. It's a huge market and a huge opportunity. Yeah.
Just to that point about, I think, the opportunity presented by this sector sort of globally, Daniel, you're a venture partner to an impact accelerator in Sweden. What do you sort of make of this opportunity presented by alternative proteins to the global food sector? And what do you make of the investment landscape globally as it stands right now?
Yeah, let's start with the latter. The market is very hot, maybe too hot. There's more and more early stage and growth stage VCs raising funds right now in agtech and food tech, and perhaps in protein in general. I mean, Lever VC, Big Idea Ventures, Agronomics, Good Protein Fund are just some examples of funds that raised, or enclosed big funds recently. And there are some other big ones out there raising, like New Crop and Dow Foods and Stray Dog and Clear Current Capital and so on. And there was data from AgFunder coming out recently saying that globally food tech companies and agtech have raised $24 billion this year. That's very close actually to the $30 billion that was raised in 2020. So the first half of this year almost saw as much growth or investment as the entire 2020. And of those 24 billion invested so far this year, 2/3 are in the US and China and India. So it's fairly concentrated to those three markets. I mean, there's so many large challenges to solve in the food system, from increasing productivity to reducing food waste and post-harvest food loss to helping consumers shift to more sustainable and nourishing dietary patterns. So I want to think that all this investment frenzy is justified, that startups and investors feel this sense of urgency to solve these challenges, and that's not just a big crazy bubble brewing. In terms of alt protein and the opportunity presented, we know protein demand is increasing by 60% towards 2050. Of course, demand is not the same thing as need. And we know that we're using the most biodiverse places on earth, like Brazil, to grow soy, and we're replacing fish with plastics in the ocean. People see these issues, and we know that the food system is a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of freshwater use, half of all vegetated land use, and animal farming is a big chunk of this. So it's obviously something we need to solve. So I think plant-based is definitely part of the solution. Eventually fermentation-based, perhaps in some areas cell-based as well. It's clear to me that it's going to win market share. We don't know where it'll plateau, but it will happen. It is happening.
Thanks for that. And Mark, for your closing views, we really love your insight on the investment landscape in India. We've seen a number of companies this year raise successful pre-seed and seed rounds, including GoodDot. So what opportunities do you see for investors in the region? I know you've alluded to some of the producer side opportunities, but what opportunities are you seeing play out in the Indian market? And when will we start seeing mega food corporations and FMCG companies start investing in the sector and really getting involved in scaling access to these products across the country?
Sure. I mean, look, I think there are probably three opportunities, maybe more, but I would say kind of three big opportunities here. Like one is basically what's been done in the West so far, which is, you know, plant-based. I'm gonna focus on plant-based because I think for now, right, talking about fermented and cellular in India is still a bit more off. I think it will come eventually, but I think how it's dealt with will be very interesting. And I'm going to focus on meat because meat and eggs, because I wanted to sort of take milk off the table. Milk is a very culturally sensitive issue in India, you know, where even the vegetarians, right, are very wedded to it. So what I would say is, you know, I think one big opportunity is what the folks at GoodDot are doing, right? They're working on creating plant analogs for the kinds of use cases that are relevant in India. Burgers are not relevant in India, right? They're eaten by some people sometimes, but it's not a fundamental part of the food here the way it is in the West. You know, so there's a lot of opportunity in various Indian formats, whether it's tikkas or biryanis or what have you, that, you know, analogs that can go into, you know, a gravy dish, a curry. So that's obviously an opportunity. We can debate the size of that opportunity, but thankfully India is big enough that, you know, even if you're focused on the top 50 million households or 100 million households, that's still quite a bit of people. You know, so that's one. The second is I genuinely believe that there is a real opportunity to create processed non-meat analog protein products for the vegetarian population. The reality is that India is a massively, you know, malnourished, sort of, it's broadly malnourished in different ways. And one of the ways is that generally people here don't eat enough protein because the diet is so carbohydrate centric, and a lot of the protein that people consume is not actually as accessible as they realize. So if we can create protein products for vegetarians that don't taste anything like meat, right, but that make protein more accessible for someone who is a vegetarian, I think that's a very powerful idea, a very good idea. And I think that can address some of the endemic malnutrition that India has always struggled with because of kind of sociocultural factors. And then finally, I think there's a great opportunity in you know, plant-based supply chains where we look at India, you know, either as a raw material exporter or hopefully, right, an ingredient exporter, or ideally a value-added product exporter that takes, you know, our low-cost manufacturing base and uses that to export to the rest of the world, where the desire for, you know, I have no debate on the thesis of plant-based analogs in countries that eat meat every single day, where most of the population eats meat. I have debates about the extent to which, you know, people have imported that thinking into India without necessarily looking at the country we actually live in. And so I think there's a great opportunity there. I think over time there will be opportunities in cellular. I think over time there will be some very significant opportunities in fermented. Again, the one thing that I will go back to again and again and again, and I know I sound like a frickin' broken record, this is a smallholder agricultural economy of tiny producers. We have 300 million head of cattle, but we have 80 million dairy farmers. So each person who's owning cows and buffaloes are generally owning 3, maybe 4. When we start, you know, that's our dairy supply chain, okay? Our goat supply chain, our mutton supply chain are farmed, not even farmed, grazed by some of the poorest shepherds in the world. Products are entirely organic. There is not a drop of animal health product used in our entire mutton value chain, right? Everything is essentially free range, grazed. I'm not saying the life of a goat is great, but I'm saying it's not a industrialized part of our agriculture. If I think about, if I think about aquaculture, you have a bit of industrial ag in shrimp, but in fish you don't. If I think about poultry, that's a bit more industrialized. But even then, it's still, right, smallholder contract farmers working with aggregators and integrators. My big fear about plant-based is that we are going to destroy the economic existence of these people for whom livestock is a major source of value. It's a major source of savings. It's a source of survival. And we're going to turn the value chains over to the largest food processing companies in the world. So we're going to basically wipe out the economic existence of a shepherd in Rajasthan with 20 goats so that 6 multinationals can make money. And that is the ethical,
I think it's important to note
that sorry, what?
I think it's important to note that we're not talking about replacing these systems, but rather supplementing the increased demand that is likely to.
I'm just saying that when you're talking about plant-based in America, I am 100% on your side, okay? Like, go fix that industrialized mess. When you're talking about doing this in a smallholder agricultural system that is barely industrialized, it is a very different ethical quandary.
I think with that, it's important to note that the Indian market presents, it's a vast population. There have been points that have been brought up time and time again about income being an impediment to protein consumption. I think there's opportunity enough for all of these different supply chains to come into play and for all of them to exist with each other. I don't think there's one solution to this problem. I think there's going to be multiple different solutions that do present itself. And within this context, I think that we can all agree that protein demand is going to increase over the next coming decade. We're going to see multiple solutions feed that problem and feed that increasing demand. And so with that, I think we're out of time as well. I'd really, really like to thank all our panelists today. Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ram. And thank you, Mark, so much for taking the time and sharing your very honest and candid views with us and the audience today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you, Nicole, for a very inspiring session. Many, many interesting notes from this hour. So thank you to our guests, and let's take a short break.